So this is feminism number two. So if you were missing the lesson for some reason this morning and you didn't manage to make sense of the handout, then this should help you. And in 6 or 9 months' time, then hopefully this is a nice little bit of revision for you as well. So what we've done so far in Feminism 1 was introduce the idea of what feminism is, who are the feminists, what do feminists want, and we also looked at two key ideas. One was about sex and gender, the idea that gender is socially constructed by men, and the other one was about the personal is political, with the argument that lots of oppression of women takes place not in the public sphere, but in the private sphere, and therefore one way of challenging it is by political activity in the private sphere as well. So this session is all about the third of those big ideas, which is about patriarchy. In the lesson this morning, when we talked about this, one of the things I did first was do a little recap, and this was really just to get us thinking about the fact that there are different types of feminists. So we're still concentrating on these three key ideas and ways in which feminists, by and large, tend to agree about gender and agree about the existence of patriarchy. But we began to pick about some differences, just so we can see what the differences are. I don't think I'm going to do all six because it'll take too long, but just to give you a clue, this one about legal reforms can change the way people see gender. It's something which liberal feminists are interested in. Liberal feminists are interested in working in the public sphere. They're interested in incremental reform, and they think that by making a series of small reforms year after year after year, then we can win more equality for women, and then eventually we'll reach a point where men and women are equal as a result of these reforms in law or reforms in the practices that we use in the public sphere. Socialist feminists don't think that because they think that society is governed by capitalism, and until we've got rid of capitalism, then we won't be able to get rid of sexism or patriarchy because it's a tool that's used by capitalists to divide men and women. And radical feminists don't think that either, and that's because if we look at this one, men and women are engaged in a war of the sexes. And so as far as some radical feminists are concerned, men and women can't ever be equal, and therefore the way to challenge gender is for women to create their own lives away from men, where they're not being forced to behave according to male rules about femininity, can make their own rules instead. Okay, so that was a quick recap of those. As I say, I won't do all six, but you can ask me about them in future lessons if you want to do a recap. Today, though, is all about patriarchy. Now, I'm not going to play this, so I want you to play it in your own time if you like, or if you can, actually. It's essential that you do. And it's a video, it's TED Talk by Laura Bates. In the lesson, we only use the first 6 minutes of this, and it's because what she does, Laura Bates set up this website and Twitter account called Everyday Sexism, in which she encourages other women to log examples of their experience, direct experience of sexism and misogyny. And in the video, she talks about being catcalled and about being sexually assaulted on the tube, actually, and then goes on to draw a line, a connection between that kind of behaviour, which exists at a kind of background level in a patriarchal, misogynistic society, and its outcomes in terms of women's oppression in their underrepresentation and inequality they face in politics, in media, in law, and in all sorts of other places of power. And so we're drawing a distinction between public and private sphere here as well, relative to what we were talking about before. So what this led us to do was to understand that when we want to talk about male domination and patriarchy, we can unpack it in rather more detail simply by saying that in one sentence, it's male-dominated society, to look at the different features of patriarchy. And Sylvia Wolby, I think this is going back to the 1970s now, broke this down into 6 structures, if you like, six ways in which men have created a system which affirms their control of it and which limits women's ability to be able to take control and oppresses women. So in each case of these, you can find a summary on page 269 of this book, which is the big one with the big fist on it. On page 269, we've got a neat little diagram. It's like that. And I've put a PDF version of this in the classroom post where this work appears, where feminism number 2 appears, so you can get access to that even if you haven't brought your book home. But what we talked about was the fact that in the state, for example, there is huge underrepresentation of women in Parliament. There are very few women in government and in cabinet, and that means that government policy and legislation does not reflect often women's interests or women's priorities. Even if it's made by well-meaning men, it misses out on the fact that women are the ones who know best what they need in order to achieve full equality. But it also comes down to the other aspects of the state as well. Who runs the police forces? And therefore, does things like policing domestic violence or allegations of rape, or the criminal justice system, and therefore makes sentences about the punishments of people who've committed rape or sexual assault or domestic violence, and so on. When we looked at culture, um, this is something that should be familiar to us from the other session as well. When we look at who are the editors of main newspapers, or who are the people who run news corporations, they're very often men, disproportionately men. There are a few women, but not very many. And therefore, the priorities of those news organisations, of those message and opinion forming institutions, are ones which don't incorporate the views of women or indeed the interests of women. And that extends all the way through to who are the leading journalists, who are the ones who write the front page newspaper copy, who are the ones who make programmes, who are the ones who make films. We're really scratching our head in our session to think about how many famous female film directors we can name. And even to ways in which we internalise this. I didn't do this in the lesson, but if I said to you, "Oh, I'm going to watch the football on Saturday," most people would be thinking about, without me even explaining it, I'd be watching something like the Champions League. This time it's Paris Saint-Germain and Bayern Munich. But automatically people would assume that both men and women would be watching the men's football there. But we don't call it men's football; we just call it football. So those very, very insidious ways in which the norm then becomes the way in which that's a male-dominated society, and women's society is seen as women's activity is seen as secondary or inferior. When we came to look at the household, um, I reminded people, if you do sociology, this is really kind of straightforward for you, that there is a unfair domestic division of labour. And time after time, year after year, surveys show that women still perform the vast majority of household tasks, that they're the ones who have to take responsibility for those household tasks, even if men do a little bit of ironing or a little bit of cooking. They are the primary caregivers. They're the ones who are most likely to be taking a career break, for example, and the ones who are least likely to have control of the finances of the home to decide whether we buy a new car or where we go on holiday or what kind of household, whether we move to a new house. When it comes to sexuality, we were thinking as well about, I've mentioned this word before, heteronormativity. The idea that patriarchy creates an idealized notion of femininity in which it effectively governs the rules for how women can behave as sexual beings. And that extends, I'm sure lots of you will have experience of this, about the different ways in which women are treated if they're promiscuous compared to the ways in which men are treated if they're promiscuous, or the ways in which parents bring up children to expect to perform different types of sexual behaviour. It also extends to the ways in which women might be people who suffer sexual violence, and that's something which will correspond to here as well on this purple one, about another feature of patriarchy. And really that kind of suppose the weapon of last resort, sometimes not even last resort, for men to control women is to use sexual assault, rape, and other forms of violence as well, emotional violence, psychological violence, so that men are controlling women in their own households, in their own families, and in their own relationships as well. Feminists are keen to point out that this is this public-private sphere thing again, that the tentacles of male control extend well beyond just what happens in public life. Lastly then, is about paid work and about the way in which women not only earn less than men on average, we call it a gender pay gap, and despite equal pay legislation, women might be less likely to be able to get access to those top jobs, or to jobs which are better paying, or have to take time out of those jobs which are better paying because they are the ones who are tasked with bringing up children. And increasingly, we've also begun to talk about the way in which women both do paid work, often work which is insecure, low skilled, low paid, supermarkets and that kind of thing, and still also have the primary responsibility of unpaid work in the household, and are the ones who do all of the emotional work in a household as well. So we sometimes talk, sociologists often talk about triple shift that women are having to put in compared to a single shift that men are putting in. Okay, so patriarchy then, we can unpack this in more ways than simply saying it means male-dominated society. It means a range of different structures uh, by which men are controlling women in society. Uh, and these are features which most feminists will agree on. Okay, so if we looked at it, I guess you could call these the answers, but really they're just choices, where we're going to say that liberal feminists, because they have an emphasis on how the law works currently and how the law can be changed to create more equality, then they're more likely to say that yes, okay, the law reflects patriarchal social policy, and that's why we can change that by making some changes to the law. Um, but radical feminists, it's not just that the state makes these laws that reflects patriarchy, it's the fact that men are in control, and even if we change the laws, men will still be in control in terms of the way in which they're executed, but also in terms of the very nature of where women live alongside men in oppressive sexual relationships as well. For socialists, on the other hand, it's going to be about changing the law won't be enough. So we've got equal pay legislation, for example, but women are still oppressed in an unequal system because it's capitalism, actually, which is the thing which is driving patriarchy to divide men and women and to put women in an inferior position. Again, I'm going to come back to those later on when we look at liberal, radical, and socialist feminism in some more detail. So that is patriarchy, and also a brief look at the relationship to the state as well. If you wanted to do a little bit more extra reading, this is an optional homework as well. But this is a really good article in the Guardian that came out a little while ago about the return of feminism and the return of people's awareness about patriarchy. It's a long read, don't be put off by that, but it also appears on Spotify as a podcast as well. So if you can find the link, I'll put it up on Classroom as well. You can find it yourselves. Okay, as usual, the same rules apply. If you're stuck with any of this or you're not sure about anything I've said in this clip, then get in touch by email and I'll try and help you out with it. But in the meantime, next time we talk about feminism, it'll be about our key thinker, Simone de Beauvoir. Okay,